hold that boundary.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the hardest.
Yeah, because we'll set a boundary and somebody feels disappointed.
Yeah. You're listening to the Spiritual Shitshow podcast with Suzanne Sole, episode 36. Hello, all you magnificent motherfuckers, and welcome to the Spiritual Shitshow podcast, where we get into the shit casserole the healing and spiritual awakening journey can be. I'm your host, Suzanne Sole, comedian, lifelong spiritual student, and I'm sharing some of the deliciousness I've learned along my journey that has helped me, and that I hope helps you too. Speaking of delicious, welcome to another delicious episode of my series, Asking for a Friend, where I bring in delicious people like ministers, therapists, artists, content creators, and the like to help us all unpack the shit show of healing and awakening and ask those big, messy questions. And I'm not just asking for myself. I'm asking for a friend. And that's you. You're the friend. You know what's a super spiritual practice? Healthy boundaries. Not the sexy kind with crystals and breath work and vibrational alignment. I mean the kind where you tell someone, no, actually, you can't talk to me like that, and stick to it. The kind where you say, I'm not available today, and mean it, even if your whole nervous system is screaming, but what if they don't like me anymore? Because here's the deal. Boundaries sound badass in theory, but in practice, they feel terrifying. Why? Because somewhere deep down, a lot of us equate setting a boundary with being mean or selfish or, God forbid, inconvenient. We're taught to be agreeable, accommodating, easy to love. And if you're someone who had to keep the peace growing up, then saying no as an adult can feel like pulling the pin on an emotional grenade. Sometimes we fear setting boundaries because we're afraid we'll be abandoned or judged or retaliated against. Sometimes we worry that we're going to hurt someone else's feelings, which, for the record, is not the same as harming them. And sometimes we're so disconnected from our own needs that we don't even know where the line is. We just know we feel off or invisible. As Brené Brown says, daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. And I'd add, setting boundaries is a love letter to yourself. But it's complicated, right? Sometimes we don't even know what our boundaries are until someone plows through them with a clown car of entitlement. And then we'll overcorrect and build a fucking moat around our personal castle with emotional alligators and a drawbridge operated by our inner child. And sometimes we confuse boundaries with punishment, which it is not, babe. So what does a healthy boundary even look like? How do you set one without apologizing profusely or making it weird? How do you tell someone they crossed a line without lighting yourself on fire with shame and self-doubt? And what the fuck are you supposed to do when someone violates your boundary and then acts like you're the problem? So to talk about this subject, I'm chatting with licensed therapist and spiritual practitioner Tom Bob Nedderman. Yes, he's back. I chitty-chatted with Tom Bob in Ep 22 where he shared his incredible story. Check it out after you watch this, of course. Tom Bob is a licensed therapist with Andersonville Psychology in Chicago and a spiritual practitioner through the Centers for Spiritual Living. He's a clinical pro, a hilarious pal, and a damn good explainer of human behavior stuff. So I had to bring him back to talk all things boundaries, how to set them, how to strengthen them, and how to survive the weird shame storms they sometimes kick up. Because sometimes growth means saying, I love you, but that doesn't work for me, and walking away. Even if your inner people pleaser is curled up in a ball rocking in the corner whispering, but what if they're mad? So for all my people pleasers, overthinkers, fawn response champions, and folks who say it's fine when it's absolutely not fine. This one's for you. Let's get into it. Tom Bob, are you there? Tom Bob Nedderman, licensed professional clinical counselor.
That's me.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
It's wonderful to have you, and I just love you so much. And your journey. So
feeling is mutual.
Thank you, darling. And your wisdom is just continues to evolve. So I wanted to bring you on to talk about everybody's favorite subject, boundaries.
What?
What are boundaries?
I know not. I have none.
What about these boundaries you speak of?
What madness is this?
What is this madness called boundaries?
It is madness.
It is madness. So, I'm just going to start with like this most simple question. What are boundaries?
I was asking myself that very same question earlier today and trying to figure out what's the best way to describe boundaries.
Right.
And I don't have a real easy, concise way, but I think here's how I understand it and think of it, of boundaries. Boundaries keep us safe.
Yeah.
They provide structure.
Yeah.
In relationships, in contracts. We have boundaries when we sign a lease for an apartment.
Right.
To protect both me and the landlord.
Right.
So if I pay my rent late, he charges me $25. That's a boundary. If he wants to decide to take out the shower in my bathroom, that would be a violation of a boundary because I signed a contract that says I get to have a shower and bathe. Eureka.
Now, so what I'm kind of getting from this, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the boundary is like a structure that you start with. So because I hear you saying it's a contract that I have with my landlord, that to me is like, this is the structure in which we are working.
That's right. That's right. And so, and sometimes boundaries just are, we have boundaries that are automatic, like social mores and norms, if you remember the Seinfeld episode of the close talker, that would be kind of a boundary violation,
Right.
Things like that we don't say, oh, if you talk close, we just have them.
Right.
But in terms of psychology and therapy, the therapeutic experience, boundaries are, they inform us when we begin to feel unsafe because something may be being violated. Mm. There may be something happening that we don't necessarily agree to.
Okay.
We have boundaries that we announce, like,
right.
If you cross this line, there's going to be hell to pay.
Right.
And then we have boundaries that we don't have to announce. We just have them. And sometimes people get really confused on all of that, of announcing them and not announcing them. My mom used to call me at, in the mornings, like at 6 o'clock in the morning. First of all, the earliest I ever see a client is at 10 o'clock, and that just nearly kills me.
6 a.m. is early for a call.
Wiping the sweat from my brow at the thought of it. And for the longest time, I said, stop calling me at 6 o'clock. And I kept answering the phone and stop, and it took me a minute to realize I keep violating my boundary.
Yeah.
So what I ultimately did was, get this.
Yeah.
I stopped answering the phone at 6 o'clock.
What? Eureka!
It's miracle of miracle, wonder of wonders.
And then I didn't have to talk to her at 6 a.m.
Exactly. And that's not a boundary that I announce. I just have it.
I just want to say, especially with family, because we're coming into the world so little and we don't know anything. And, every family's different. And I'm sure so much stuff is unintentional as well, where boundaries are being crossed because you're a kid. So why should you have boundaries? But I don't think people realize that they're teaching their children to grow up and not have boundaries.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
We don't typically think of kids needing boundaries, but kids do need boundaries.
Yeah.
And we depend on our elders, our adults in our life, our parents or whoever it is that's raising us to model those boundaries.
Yeah.
And also enforce those boundaries.
Right.
And, in cases of trauma, and abuse, whether it be physical, sexual, even emotional abuse,
Yeah.
those are egregious violations
Yeah.
of people's boundaries, and particularly kids.
Yeah.
And their kids are particularly susceptible because, they look to these adults to be their caretakers, their protectors, their role models. And when they're not, wow,
does damage.
Job security for me, I'm telling you.
But it's like at the same time, it's just like a cycle, a vicious cycle. It's like this person didn't get taught boundaries by their parent, and then so they didn't have any as an adult. So then they have kids, and they don't realize, you know,
or not even whether they have kids or not. They don't have a knowledge or understanding of boundaries. They don't know that they can draw boundaries. They don't know that they can say no.
Right. Do you find that people who have like problems holding their boundaries with other people also have problems respecting other people's boundaries?
100%. Yeah. Well, they don't know, first of all, they probably don't even know that they need boundaries.
Right.
So the idea of holding boundaries,
Right.
that may do that sometimes organically, like the boundary that doesn't be announced. It's like, but often people who violate boundaries have been violated themselves.
Yeah.
Probably more often than not.
Right.
People who violate boundaries also have been violated.
Yeah.
The thing about boundaries is everybody gets to have them and decide what they are, what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with. And that's a chore. That's a tall order in and of itself to first, one, identify I need boundaries.
Yeah.
Two, identify what the actual boundary is. And then this is the real kicker. Holding that boundary in the face of other people's reactions to the boundary.
Hold that boundary. Hold that boundary.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the hardest.
Yeah, because we'll set a boundary and somebody feels disappointed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or angry or hurt or whatever. And then here's what happens is often people will then not have the boundary and
they just let it go.
It's not a good situation.
Right. So when we're in these situations, because I know I've been in them many times, and obviously as you get older, and obviously as you get older, as you also, I'm sure, know that you get better at it because you don't feel, you realize that you're not as dependent on other people's approval of you as you thought you were.
Yes, getting older. I applied for Medicare last week. I'll be 65 soon.
Oh!
I'm okay. I'm all right.
I still love you. You're still my Gason.
I went with Plan N.
Okay, everyone, he's gone
Plan
with Plan N.
It was either G or N. I went with N.
Okay. So, but my thing is that, before we get to that place, and I'm still, we still experience that, where that person, especially someone who's important to us in our lives, and we exercise a boundary and they don't like it. And whether they guilt us or get upset or they get angry and they don't talk to us, what are some things that we could do? Because it's a tough spot to be in, especially when it's just not some, random person in your life, when it's someone you have in your life that's close to you.
What do you do when somebody
guilts you
into the,
or is angry?
You still have the boundary.
Right.
You just have it.
Yeah.
And then you develop a thick skin. In psychological terms, we call it, you'll have to develop some distress tolerance.
Okay.
We go into distress because you're upset with me.
100%.
You're angry and making me feel guilty, and it's distress. And so we have to build a tolerance for that distress until it's not distressful anymore.
So, okay. So I want to break that down because I think that is really, really important and helpful. So obviously, we all go into distress when our loved one is like, I don't like that boundary. I'm offended by it. I feel hurt by it, whatever it is. And we go into distress. Our nervous system goes wackadoodle.
Yeah, we get into that. Often that's when we go into that fight or flight mode.
Right.
We shut down. What's it? Ventravagal. Somebody more astute than me.
It's
can name what
ventravagal.
that-
I think you're correct. Yeah.
Yes, and that gets, so there's like levels here, right?
Yeah.
So if we go into a fight or flight mode, or we amp up and brace for the fight, which is actually a higher vibration than the bottom tier, if you will, where we just shut down. Mm-hmm. We become so passive and forlorn and get walked all over. And that's what a lot of people do. They just shut down. And I'd rather see somebody fight and say, fuck you. You're still engaged a little more than just, check out.
So what's happening for the person? So if they're going into defense, if they're going into fight and flight, they're doing it because they feel like threatened or that they're not going to be okay if this person doesn't allow them to have that boundary. And then I want to hear about what happens when they fall apart.
Well, here's what needs to happen. This is what I can say.
Yeah.
So when my partner does not respect the boundary, or maybe it's not even an issue of disrespect, it just violates the boundary. Here's the thing. There has to be a consequence.
Right.
100% of the time, there absolutely must be a consequence. Now, it's commensurate with the level of violation and the boundary, of course, It's not like, oh, you ate the last banana, and so I'm leaving you. It's over.
That's really a big response. That's a 10, and we need you at a 3.
Yes. But there has to be a consequence, because if there's not, then there's no point in having the boundary.
Okay, so how do we implement a consequence without it feeling like we're trying to be controlling or manipulative? You know what I mean?
Well, where does that come from? Where does the idea that we're controlling and manipulative come when we say, yeah, I went grocery shopping and please don't eat my bananas?
Yeah, it comes from...
How is that? That's a skewed framework to begin with, that I'm manipulative and controlling because I asked you not to eat my bananas. That's a whole nother issue.
Yeah, that comes from not having boundaries. Not having healthy boundaries, and then you see.
Well, if we're coming from a trauma background, and by trauma I mean some sort of abuse, sex, emotional, psychological, verbal, physical abuse. If it's coming out of trauma, then, we've got self-esteem issues, we've got self-worth, and I don't matter, I don't deserve, and all of those kind of things can come into play, which impacts why I may or may not have a boundary, or why I may cave in the face of somebody pushing back.
Right.
And even the pushback is a bit of a violation. It's a lack of respect for, here's what I'm voicing and what I need, and please don't cross that line. And they come right up to it and put their little toes over the line. That's just that's childish.
Yes, agreed. And I've had to do that, what you're sharing, have that conversation of, listen, I've said it several times, and I've said no, and you're not respecting my no. And that doesn't feel good. And people are like, what? What do you mean?
Yeah, and that's where I've said no, and I've said no several times, And the reason it keeps going several times is because the initial violation didn't have a consequence.
Right. Oh, okay. So say,
We train people to violate our boundaries often.
wow.
In a sense, and the initial violation doesn't have a consequence. So that gives the message that they're not really serious.
Do you think it's because in that moment we feel powerless? Like to be able to do anything about it?
Well, I'm sure that probably comes into play. The word that comes to mind more to me in this moment is unworthiness. That whole list of I don't deserve it.
I don't deserve to be respected. I don't deserve to have boundaries.
And this is probably a person that's saying that to themselves who has been violated over and over, probably has some kind of complex PTSD, which is an ongoing, regular occurring childhood abuse.
Yeah.
That has learned that has been given the message that they aren't worthy, they don't deserve respect, they're not entitled to any kind of respect.
Yeah.
And so then they go out into the world and they pick people who will actually do what was done to them.
Yeah.
In fact, the saying goes that until a trauma is healed, we recreate that trauma. We go to work, we've had our abusive moms or dads or uncles or whoever it is, our abusive person, and we take a job with somebody basically who is our abusive person.
It's like incredible. And you're like, how am I here? How am I here?
We
dealing with this person.
We unconsciously choose it.
It's crazy.
This is where I get into the woo-woo a little bit. And, as I said before, I never poo-poo the woo-woo.
Don't ever poo-poo the woo-woo.
It's not that somebody consciously goes out, let me go find somebody that will be just like my mommy and abuse me and treat me like shit, because that's who I want to work for.
Right.
Or that's who I want to date.
Yeah,
I do think there often are signs, red flags that we ignore.
Yeah.
We're trying to work something out.
Yeah.
That's why we choose these people over and over again, because we're trying to work out that original trauma.
Yeah.
Here's the rub, the bitter pill to swallow here. Like, let's say I'm working out abandonment issues, and I pick men who will leave and not be trustworthy and not be true to their word and not really available and all that kind of stuff, and abandon me, et cetera, et cetera. And the feeling, and I'm actually speaking about my own experience here. You could put me at that Beyonce concert that's happening this weekend here in Chicago. And out of all the gay men, and believe me, there are a few gay men in that concert. Out of all the gay men, the one across the arena that kind of, hey, what's up? And I make my way through the crowd and, I'm already involved. Oh, I'm straight. I'm a drug addict. I'm an alcoholic. Something that says that, but
not
the
available.
feeling inside is if I can win you over, it's as if I won over that father of mine that abandoned me.
Yes.
However, the bitter pill, let me get back to the point, is that so I win you over and all is well. It doesn't actually work out my stuff around my father.
Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think it does. I think we still have to work out our issues with our abuser. Me working it out with you, and you turn out to be a great guy. That's great.
Right.
I've still got my issues with the person. My issues were never with you to begin with.
Right. Do you think that situation can make you aware that you're still like, oh, I thought I was done with that, but obviously I'm not because I've been triggered by this person in that same old way?
Well, going the whole thing here, when you asked what do we do when people violate and we're melting and the ventral vagal thing gets ignited and all that kind of stuff, the name of the game is practice.
Yeah.
We just keep practicing.
Yeah.
It's not a quick fix. In any first session I have with a client, I make it very clear I am not a quick fix kind of guy. I don't believe in them.
Yeah.
I don't believe it exists. We have aha moments and wow,
Right.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
But then there's still the tediousness of putting that into practice in concrete ways in our daily life, so that we move it out of theory and into a concrete lived experience.
Yeah.
And that's practice.
Yeah.
And we do it well some days, and some days it's like, what the fuck am I doing? I am so screwed up.
Yeah. You just I got
Practice.
caught in that same old cycle again, and I just didn't even see it coming.
And just like any ism, and by ism, like alcoholism, the ism, we get to start over again as many times as we need to in any given day. In any given day.
I love that.
And it's the same with these other things. In fact, the ism is just a symptom of the crack that's going on inside.
Yeah. Y'all, I had to make a part 2 of this juicy ass conversation about boundaries with Tom Bob because we got into it. And I don't want you to miss out on any of it. So check out episode 38 for part 2. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you on the next one. And you can roll it, you foxy minx.